There are many questions pertaining to article types and article structure, and few questions which are asked are are there any guidelines which one can follow for article structure? If yes, which are the guidelines which can be used for, say, RCTs, case reports, and how to use them and make the most of these guidelines? So the answer to all these questions would be EQUATOR network, which is like a one-stop shop for all your guideline related needs. And to elaborate more on this topic, I'd like to invite Dr. Girish Tillu, editor of Journal of Ayurveda and Integrative Medicine.
A good session by a BMJ editor, Dr. Trish Groves, at 11:30, so I will keep that in mind and conclude my topic. There are many platforms for the help of authors, and we have to use those platforms or those efforts very smart way to improve our reporting, even our drafting papers. And what we should think about a doctor who uses wrong treatment, either in willfully or through ignorance, or who uses right treatment wrongly? The answer to the question will be the same as, should we think about researchers who use wrong techniques to use right techniques wrongly, misinterpret their results, report their results selectively, cite the literature selectively? And this was a statement written in the paper Scandal of Poor Medical Research in 1994. And the author said, we need less research, but better research, and research done for the right reasons. Friends, journals are increasing, papers are increasing, but is the quality of health, indicators of health, are they increasing? The answer is not affirmative. And the concern raised right from 1994 by a visionary scientist, Douglas Altman. He founded Center of Statistics in Medicine, University of Oxford. Douglas Altman passed away last month, and he initiated lot many things in this area. We pay tribute to Douglas Altman in this workshop. I'm going to discuss briefly about article types and reporting guidelines. This is the competing interest. The speaker is an editor of Journal of Ayurveda and Integrative Medicine, and I may share some data, examples, experiences related to the journal. Friends, we are experiences push for publication, for post, authority, increments, chairmanship, positions, etc. But this real spirit has to be remembered. We should know that paper, they shape science. Paper, they don't just increase API or H index of that particular author, but the paper shapes science. Despite of Dr. Pai just mentioned, this particular paper actually fueled research in new discipline and say molecular biology and many other disciplines. They emerge out of just one-page paper by Watson and Crick in Nature. Paper, they save lives. The home-based care by neonatal sepsis, this particular paper that changed the policies of all the development world to manage neonatal sepsis. And thus, one particular paper can change lives, and that we need to remember. The least uttered word in any of the medical conferences is patient. Many times we tend to forget the end user of entire business, that is patient, and we need to remember that whatever we are going to publish, directly or indirectly, that is going to play with patients' lives, people's lives. Papers that transform practice. For example, one particular paper shared by a doctor in Journal of Alternative Medicine, that paper is now changing practice of management of filariasis in our country. Paper transform experiments into knowledge. For example, this paper by Dean Ornish has now given birth to a new discipline called as behavioral medicine. Papers systematize knowledge. You will be amazed to see we can access paper from New England Journal of Medicine right from 1st January 1812. We can access online papers in Lancet from 5th October 1823. That is systematization of knowledge. Whenever we publish, we systematize that knowledge so that people can track that history of more than 200 years. Papers teach research approaches, that also we need to discuss. This is a paper by 560 authors, 6 consortia, 90 institutes. Means whatever we read, that has a very good message if we read good. And we all know the life cycle of an idea to a paper, and there is also life cycle of a paper. Idea generate question, we generate data, and we add to new knowledge and following excellence, expertise, and ethics, and that generates a paper. So the one paper is a culmination of a lot of efforts from ideas, experiments, and all. The peer review process that also needs some discussion in this forum that makes all the difference, the peer review process, the systematic review of a manuscript that many times has a multidimensional evaluation by experts pertaining to that idea, experiment, and methods, and that makes a lot of difference. I took this slide from my friend Kishore Patwardhan. Thus, like life cycle of an idea, there is also life cycle of a paper. Publication is not just a full stop. Many times, the authors, they cite, and citation gives us award, fame, edge index, appreciation, etc. Many times, after publication, the paper undergoes correction. That also, correction also gets published online. Many times, people revisit that idea, they modify that idea, discuss, debate that idea. Many times, people reanalyze your data. And that happens mostly in papers related to meta-analysis. Authors of meta-analysis, they may ask raw data or they reanalyze data in a different way. And papers they also undergo retraction. And the authors involved, they may face criticism, loss of career, reputation, etc. Thus, paper is something, a live entity forever. Many papers published in last decade, they also keep getting citations even today. Thus, once ever anything goes online in a systematic database that gets citations or criticism, whatever. What we can publish, this is also an article, the topic assigned to me. We can publish review, and review, all we know, review is beyond compilation based on extensive published data, new interpretation, new insights, new angles we need for the review. This experimental research, also is very important. Short communication. This is also a type of paper where we have, say, pilot study, proof of concept study, small data to publish. We can write short communication, case reports, book reviews. Many journals, they write case reports in a different way. There are many times debates, they are also published in journal. Thus, not everything needs original data from research. This paper is a platform that shares ideas, thoughts, maybe for discussion, debate, follow-up. I request you to read this very interesting essay authored by John Ioannidis from Stanford. Why most published research findings are false. And he critically analyzes the recommendation or the validity of research and its connection to research methodology and research design, which is followed appropriately. There are journals. Again, this journal is editor-in-chief was Douglas Altman till last month. This journal publishes clinical trial protocols, and there is again egg and say chicken story. We don't have funding, and hence we cannot say move for trials, and if we don't publish trials, we don't get funding. But we can publish study protocol very systematically, and if study protocol gets published, that gets author some validity, some reputation, and a sound protocol to study further. And hence, many journals accept study protocols, and for authors, those are initiating a study, it is better to get study protocol published. Many journals, for example, in Journal of Pharmacology, they publish drug watch, specific information about that particular drug. Journals, they also publish some good practices, publishing guidelines, etc. Many times, the research, what is published, is not very dry. BMJ publishes every year Christmas collection, and one should read this Christmas collection. That is a funny way of stating the story. And this article, for example, that says how parachute used to prevent death and major trauma. Thus, the argument is not every study requires RCT. So there are studies, those also don't need RCT. That has been put in funny way. So we can also read very good stuff to write. Cochrane Library is again a very important source where we can read meta-analysis based systematic review, and that also discusses the quality of various articles. Thus, God is in details. And those details, if we want to report in our journal, then this is a one-stop shop for researchers, authors, even guideline developers, librarians, and that is EQUATOR network. EQUATOR is an acronym of enhancing the quality and transparency of health research. And Douglas Altman and David Moher and other methodology researchers, they have initiated this platform. And this gives us a detail. This EQUATOR network has various statements. For example, consort statement, that stands for consolidated standards for reporting trials. STROBE, that is strengthening the reporting of observational studies in epidemiology. Case reports, that is care statement. PRISMA, that is for transparent reporting of systematic reviews. Thus, based on various types of research articles, we can select respective statement, and that gives us a standard checklist for constructing or structuring our research article according to various types. The importance of this statement is, or the checklist items are useful for authors. They are also useful for reviewers and editors, because our reviewers can immediately know which items of that particular checklist they have followed, and the items which need to be included in revision. Thus, for various studies, for example, the people working on animal in vivo research, there are ARRIVE guidelines, that is animal research reporting in vivo experiments. If you take an example of consort checklist, the checklist is a systematic compilation of what needs to be reported on various sections. For example, as a title and abstract, what we need to report. In background or introduction, what we need to report. In methods, trial design, participants, intervention, outcomes, sample size, randomization, sequence generation. Thus, this checklist is useful for authors as a superset. It is not necessary that every item needs to be considered in that particular research design, because that may be different, or some aspects may not be applicable for that particular research. If the research is an open label trial, then allocation, concealment or sequence generation may not be applicable to that particular research. But this superset gives author a very good framework to write further. And there are various important items, for example, harms or adverse events. Thus, once everything is in place before authors write, and if we want to write, we have to do accordingly. We have to document accordingly. And the beauty of these guidelines and checklist is, before we start our experiment, we know what we are going to write, what we have to report, and accordingly we can plan and document that information in retrospect. There are such flow charts. For example, patient's flow. What happened at every level of patient enrollment, allocation in treatment arms, follow-up, and analysis. And what happened to those numbers? How many patients were screened for eligibility criteria or inclusion criteria? How many actually randomized in treatment arms? How many of them completed trial? At every step, if there is loss of numbers, what are the reasons for that particular loss? And whether treatment gave any adverse events or loss to follow-up, what happened to data, and how many numbers actually analyzed. So thus, it gives a very clear flow of information that needs to be documented, and this is a template which authors can use. Again, many times our researchers, they have to develop protocols, interventional protocols, and for such interventional protocols, these guidelines are SPIRIT guidelines, that stands for Standard Protocol Items Recommendations for Interventional Trials. Whenever we develop our experimental protocol, that takes care of reporting, because if we develop the protocol systematically, after completion of our experiment, we have relevant data or relevant points to communicate, and thus we editors, we recommend to follow SPIRIT protocol, then and then only you can follow other guidelines of reporting and publication. This is the protocol, and they have published in various biomedical journals. These EQUATOR network gives a very interesting and very elaborate flow chart. That flow chart tells us the nature of our research, related research design, and accordingly which guideline or which protocols checklist we need to follow. For example, there is research on human, yes, if the research generate quantitative data, yes, if that research combine and analyze result of previous studies, yes, if that research review on observational cohort, then yes, then you have to use this particular statement. If the research describe the relationship between exposure and outcome, for example, risk or protective factors and outcome, then one has to use a STROPE statement. If the research is on randomized trial comparing two or more health intervention, then we have to use consort statement, for example. And then thus this simple flow chart will be helpful for researcher to actually decide which particular checklist they need to follow. There are many related initiatives to these reporting standards which we need to take a note of. These are national ethics guidelines recently published by Indian Council of Medical Research, and we have Dr. Ravi Gui here who participated in actually development of this ethics guideline. This need to be followed especially for research involving human participants. Otherwise, many, almost all good journals, they don't entertain papers if those ethics guidelines they have not followed. Along with this, Dr. Pai mentioned this registry of clinical trials. This is again a very important initiative to improve transparency, accountability, and accessibility of clinical trial protocols. Otherwise, negative studies were ignored by investigators. Another problem was of selective reporting. For example, there is an intervention and there are 4 outcomes, and the investigator got positive results in 2 outcomes, 2 endpoints, and other endpoints they got, say, negative results, and they got a particular adverse drug event. Now, it becomes mandatory for investigators to state what actually they are going to evaluate, which will be the inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, which will be the primary, secondary outcome measures, how they are going to report adverse drug events, and everything that is to be uploaded on CTRI website. And we can access the data of CTRI website if we do particular search. For example, this morning, breast cancer related ongoing and completed studies are 287 in our country. So based on the CTRI registration number, and if authors they submit their papers, editors and reviewers, they are expected to go to the CTRI, then read that particular protocol and check whether whatever they have mentioned in the protocol, they have been reporting accordingly. Whether there are mismatch in inclusion criteria, in interventions, in outcomes, measurement, and everything. Thus, this CTRI initiative is not just a database that practically helps authors and researchers to actually assess quality of their reporting and whether their reporting is according to their protocol which they have uploaded a priori. For example, there are registries of systematic review protocols. If somebody is doing systematic review, then that person has to register that protocol, how that systematic review will be, what will be the major outcomes considering, and how the data will be analyzed, data will be searched and all from prospective registration of systematic review protocol. There are again campaigns like Open Data Campaign from BMJ. So it says that in January 2013 that BMJ will not longer publish any trial of drugs or devices whether author do not commit to making relevant anonymized patient data available or on the reasonable request. Thus, these open data initiatives, many journals, they are now follow this initiative, and thus once we publish our paper, our data has to be made available online for other researchers if they want to reanalyze our data. So this is again very important initiative. Thus, the life cycle of paper from idea to protocol, IEC approval, ethics guidelines, adherence, CTRI registration, protocol publication, data analysis, manuscript submission, peer review. And this peer review process again tracks whether CTRI registration or ethics guidelines are adhered to. I am talking especially about clinical manuscripts, of course. Publication and analysis validation of published data is also a possibility even after we publish a paper. Thus, paper also have effects, those are beyond measurement. We can use research papers in classrooms to teach a subject. We learn a lot from reading. A good review is actually undergoing a training program ourselves, and thus there are many intangible or effects beyond measurement. Papers to people and people to planet. That link we need to remember, especially on the background of concept of One Health. Thus, research paper have lot of measurable and unmeasurable effects. With this, thank you very much for patient hearing. Because of the time constraint, we skipped some of the aspect.